how a story begins, not with a war or a famine, but with a birth, a moment that should have brought unbridled joy to the ivory kingdom of Eldoria, land once famed for its beauty, its sprawling fertile plains, and its people known for their gentle spirit and their reverence for life. Prince Kellen was born to King Tyrant the Just and Queen Is, a beloved couple whose reign had brought unparalleled peace and prosperity to Eldoria. A sudden, virulent plague swept through the kingdom, claiming lives indiscriminately, and the king, tirelessly attending to his ailing subjects, succumbed to the illness. Eldoria, in its wisdom, had a long tradition of regents ruling in the name of a child monarch. His coronation was a spectacle of somber grandeur, yet beneath the pomp and ceremony, a palpable unease permeated the court. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken apprehension. The child king, his face perfectly impassive, his eyes unnervingly bright, looked out upon his assembled subjects, a gaze that seemed to penetrate their very souls. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he raised his small hand. "Justice," he declared, his voice ringing with a chilling authority, "is absolute. To mock the crown is to mock Eldoria. Let him be executed at dawn, and let the method be theatrical." Minor transgressions were no longer just crimes. They were opportunities for the child king to indulge his macabre curiosity, to experiment with the boundaries of power, to craft new, increasingly theatrical forms of punishment. His games, once confined to wooden soldiers, now extended to the living, breathing subjects of his kingdom. He would sit on his ivory throne, a tiny figure in an enormous hall, and with a casual wave of his small hand, decree fates that would shatter lives. The haunting image of the jester hanging from the tower was now just the first stroke in a canvas of grotesque artistry, a prelude to the chilling symphony of his reign. The stage was set, the kingdom cowed, for the full, terrifying manifestation of a child's perverse imagination, now unrestrained by conscience or empathy, wielding the ultimate power of life and death. The shadow of the cradle had indeed fallen, and it was a shadow so vast, so dark, that it threatened to engulf the entire ivory kingdom in an endless night of innocent, terrifying cruelty. A farmer who mistakenly allowed his sheep to graze on royal land was not merely fined. He was ordered to stand naked in the town square for a day, while a flock of royal sheep were paraded around him, their bleating mocking his humiliation. It was a bizarre, almost comical punishment, but delivered with such cold authority that it instilled a new, insidious kind of fear. The laughter in the streets grew subdued, replaced by hushed conversations and nervous glances. The people moved with exaggerated caution, their smiles strained, their eyes perpetually downcast, avoiding the gaze of the palace, fearing the unpredictable whims of their child ruler. "Let him hang from the highest tower, so all may see the price of disrespect." The court was stunned into silence. This was not justice. This was something far darker. This was a king, a child king, who seemed to take a perverse delight in the spectacle of punishment. The jester was hanged at dawn, his brightly colored costume a stark, grotesque stain against the gray morning sky. The image was indeed haunting, and it was the first of many. It was as if the ancient power of the throne had awakened something dormant within him, or perhaps simply stripped away the last vestiges of true childhood innocence, revealing the chilling entity that had always resided beneath. The mask of detached wisdom began to crack, revealing something far more unsettling beneath. She pleaded, she reasoned, she threatened. But Kellen, with his precocious intellect and his unnerving composure, parried her every attempt. He cited legal precedents, argued the necessity of absolute authority, and, with a chilling calmness, reminded her of her own grief-induced abdication of power. His arguments were unassailable, his will unyielding. She found herself powerless, trapped in a gilded cage, forced to witness the terrifying transformation of her son, a transformation that left her heart colder than any tomb. The advisors, too, found themselves outmaneuvered, their wisdom rendered impotent against the child king's relentless logic and the unyielding force of his burgeoning cruelty. They were afraid, profoundly so, of the child on the throne, who wielded power with the unthinking ruthlessness of a toy soldier, but with the very real consequence of life and death. He began to demand increasingly elaborate reports on the details of not just the legal specifics, but the practicalities, the reactions of the condemned, the intricacies of the process. He would summon the royal executioner, a grim and taciturn man, and questioned him for hours, his small face alight with an unnerving curiosity. Did the rope break cleanly? Did he struggle much? Was the crowd suitably impressed? The executioner, a man accustomed to the grim realities of his profession, found himself profoundly disturbed by the Child King's unsettling fascination, by the perverse joy that seemed to emanate from his small, innocent form. Queen Isolde, though grief-stricken, was expected to assume this role, guided by the counsel of the most venerable elders. The kingdom, still reeling from the plague, slowly began to recover under his precocious guidance. But amidst this apparent competence, the first shadows began to lengthen. Kellen's fascination with punishment, once a disturbing curiosity, began to manifest in his decrees. Minor infractions, previously met with fines or public apologies, now received increasingly harsh sentences. A baker who cheated on the weight of his bread found himself in the stocks for a week, not just a day. A servant caught pilfering a silver trinket was publicly flogged, not merely dismissed. The punishments, though severe, were still within the bounds of historical precedent, albeit on the harsher end. The court dismissed it as the Child King's fervent adherence to justice, a strong moral compass that sought to root out corruption. But Kellen, even at 5, displayed an iron will that belied his tender years. He refused to be merely a figurehead. A jester, known for his biting wit and often irreverent humor, dared to make a subtle, mocking jest about the king's youth during a court performance. It was a slight easily overlooked, but Kellen's eyes, usually devoid of strong emotion, narrowed him. The court expected a reprimand, perhaps a banishment. Instead, Kellen, his small voice unnervingly calm, declared that the jester had committed treason of the tongue, an ancient, almost forgotten law that carried the penalty of death. The court gasped. The jester, his face paling beneath his painted grin, fell to his knees, begging for mercy. Queen Isolde, jolted from her grief-induced stupor, interceded, pleading for her son to show compassion, to remember the jester's years of loyal, if boisterous, service. With a chilling clarity that stunned the court, he declared his intention to rule, not as a child, but as a king. His arguments were precise, his logic unsettlingly mature, drawn from the very scrolls on governance he had so meticulously studied. He quoted ancient laws, spoke of divine right, and articulated a vision of absolute authority with a conviction that few adults could muster. The council, accustomed to the gentle rule of Tyrant, found themselves bewildered, their arguments faltering against the unwavering gaze of the boy king. Queen Isolde, still weakened by illness and heartbroken by her husband's death, could offer no effective resistance, her maternal instincts overwhelmed by her son's uncanny resolve and the weight of the crown. The kingdom plunged into mourning, a profound sorrow that touched every corner of Queen Isolde, consumed by grief and weakened by her own brush with the plague, became a shadow of her former self. In the midst of this profound sorrow, Kellen, barely 5 years old, showed no outward signs of grief. His face remained impassive, his eyes dry. He attended his father's funeral with an unsettling composure, observing the weeping courtiers with a detached, almost scientific curiosity. His mother, too lost in her own sorrow, found a strange comfort in his stoicism, mistaking his lack of outward grief for immense inner strength, a resilience beyond his years. Kellen was their only child, born after many years of desperate prayers and the fading hopes of a lineage. He was a beautiful infant, with eyes the color of summer skies and hair like spun gold. The kingdom rejoiced, showering the royal couple with gifts and blessings. Convinced that this child was a divine blessing, a guarantee of continued peace and prosperity for generations to come. Yet, even in his cradle, there were subtle, almost imperceptible signs that marked Kellen as different. He rarely cried, his gaze, even as a babe, possessed an unsettling intensity, and his laughter, when it came, was a dry, almost mechanical sound, devoid of true mirth. These were dismissed as the idiosyncratic quirks of a unique, destined child, the nervous observations of overly superstitious nurses. As Kellen grew, his intelligence became undeniably brilliant, far surpassing that of other children his age. He mastered languages with astonishing speed, absorbed complex political doctrines with a keen understanding, and displayed a memory that bordered on photographic. His tutors, initially awed by his precocity, soon found themselves subtly unnerved by his detachment. He showed little emotion. His curiosity was directed not towards the wonders of the world, but towards the intricate mechanisms of power, the strategies of war, and, most disturbing, the ancient laws pertaining to crime and punishment. He devoured scrolls on judicial proceedings, his small fingers tracing the archaic script, detailing various forms of execution, his sky-blue eyes, though bright, remaining chillingly unblinking as he absorbed the grim details. His questions were disturbingly precise. How long does it take for a man to truly expire on the gallows? Or what is the most efficient way to remove a traitor's head? His tutors, attributing it to a child's morbid curiosity, dismissed these inquiries with nervous laughter and swift changes of subject. The turning point, the first tangible crack in the veneer of royal innocence, came with the tragic and unexpected death of King Tyrant. With King Tyrant's death, the crown passed to young Kellen, and so, Kellen ascended the ivory throne, a diminutive figure swallowed by the vast, ornate chair, his small hands gripping the heavy scepter. His reign began subtly enough. He issued edicts with remarkable foresight, streamlined bureaucratic processes, and displayed a strategic mind that astonished his advisors. The true, chilling nature of his rule began to emerge with the trial of the Whispering Fool. Kellen listened, his head tilted slightly, his eyes fixed on his mother, a flicker of something almost akin to amusement in their depths. After the jester's execution, a subtle but profound shift occurred in Kellen. The queen, now fully aware of the monster she had unwittingly nurtured, tried to intervene. The kingdom began to change. The once gentle people of Eldoria found themselves living under a pall of fear. Kellen, meanwhile, reveled in his absolute power. He saw no cruelty, only the logical application of authority, the creative expression of his will. The chilling precedent set by the jester's execution solidified Kellen's absolute authority, not through respect, but through a pervasive, paralyzing fear. The court, once a vibrant hub of intrigue and intellectual discourse, transformed into a hushed echo chamber where every word was weighed, every gesture scrutinized. He no longer simply decreed a death, he meticulously designed the manner of its unfolding. A minor court official, a distant cousin of a disgraced noble, was found to have inadvertently placed a ceremonial crown belonging to a long-dead king upon a lesser pedestal during a forgotten festival preparation. She threw herself at Kellen's feet, tears streaming down her face, begging him to reconsider, to show mercy, to remember his father's gentle justice. Her pleas were met with a chilling, dispassionate silence. Kellen merely looked down at her, his expression unreadable, then turned to go. The once bustling market squares grew quiet, the spontaneous laughter replaced by strained silence. Children were admonished not to make loud noises, lest they draw the king's attention. Parents taught their offspring to always keep their eyes downcast when royal processions passed, to never speak above a whisper of anything that could be construed as dissent. Farmers, fearing their harvests might be confiscated, or their lives taken on a whim, cultivated only enough to survive. His network of child spies, children barely older than himself, chosen for their keen observation skills and their chilling loyalty, permeated every village, every household. They were rewarded for reports of dissent, however minor, and their innocent faces, so easily dismissed, held the power of life and death over their neighbors. Each one was a brushstroke in Kellen's terrifying masterpiece, a testament to his unique and monstrous reign. The sounds of joy had been replaced by the rustle of silken robes in a hushed court, the distant cries of a condemned soul, and the unnerving, soft laughter of a child, echoing through the grand, silent halls of the palace. This was the true horror of the child king, not the deliberate malice of a tyrant, but the unthinking innocent, depravity of a mind that saw life and death as nothing more than a game, a source of endless twisted entertainment. The theater of cruelty was in full swing, and the audience, silent and terrified, could only watch as their world spiraled further into the abyss of his imagination. The darkest chapters of Xylos were yet to be fully written, for the child king's reign, driven by an accelerating hunger for novelty, was only just beginning to truly unfurl its shadowed wings. The terror was not just of the king, but of each other, fostering a pervasive distrust that fractured communities and prevented any organized resistance. The people, battered and broken, lived in a state of collective psychological paralysis, their will to resist slowly eroded by the constant, unpredictable cruelty. Artisans lost their creative spirit, their hands growing hesitant, their designs devoid of joy. The vibrant markets became desolate. The once bustling trade routes grew quiet. Foreign emissaries, initially drawn by tales of Eldoria's wealth, quickly became aware of the pervasive dread. Their initial awe at the child king's precocity transformed into thinly veiled horror. They made their excuses quickly, departing Eldoria with a haste that bordered on flight, spreading terrifying whispers of the king of the gibbet and the child of chains throughout the known world. Eldoria, once a respected power, became an Aparia kingdom, its borders shunned, its very name synonymous with unspeakable cruelty. Fear, a cold, pervasive mist, seeped into every corner of Eldoria, smothering joy, stifling dissent, and twisting the very spirit of the kingdom. The traditional reverence for the crown transformed into a morbid fascination, a desperate attempt to understand the incomprehensible, to predict the next cruel whim. His executions were not about justice, nor even about maintaining order. They were about performance, about art, about the sheer, unbridled power of his will. He would often command Gorak to improvise, to deviate from established methods, to introduce new elements of spectacle or psychological torment. He would spend nights poring over designs for new instruments of death, giggling softly to himself as he imagined the reactions of his next unwitting victim. His mind, unburdened by empathy, was a fertile ground for the most grotesque imaginings, fueled by an insatiable hunger for control and the spectacle of pain. "Ensure every detail is observed," he commanded, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. She spent her days cloistered in her chambers, her face etched with despair, her eyes perpetually haunted. She had failed to reach her son, failed to stem the tide of his burgeoning cruelty. Her love, once an anchor, was now a source of agonizing torment. As she watched the innocent child she had nurtured transform into a monstrous parody of a king, she attempted to secretly send messages to neighboring kingdoms, pleading for intervention, for a benevolent hand to guide her son, or perhaps to remove him from the throne. But Kellen's spies, loyal only to him, discovered her attempts. He did not punish her with public execution. His cruelty was more refined for his own mother. He confined her to the highest tower of the palace, a luxurious prison, but stripped her of all contact with the outside world, save for silent, grim-faced servants. Her only view was of the execution square, where, on days of public spectacle, she was forced to watch, a silent, weeping witness to her son's unfolding depravity. Lord Varen's execution was a grotesque, drawn-out affair, meticulously orchestrated to the king's exact specifications. Their attempts to reason with Kellen, to guide him towards more merciful or pragmatic policies, were met with cold indifference or subtle, chilling threats. A wise elder, Lord Valerius, dared to suggest that the king's current methods might inspire rebellion. Kellen, with a predatory gleam in his eyes, simply smiled. Rebellion, but who would dare, when the price of even a whispered thought of defiance is so creatively displayed? The next week, Lord Valerius was found in his study, utterly mad, tearing at his own hair, babbling incoherently about invisible chains and silent screams. No one dared to question what had transpired, but the message was clear. Kellen's reach extended beyond mere physical punishment. He was capable of breaking minds as well as bodies. The man's agony, his humiliation, and his eventual, agonizing death played out before a silent, horrified populace. Kellen himself watched from a high balcony, his small form barely visible, his gaze fixed on the spectacle, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. It was then that the people understood with a chilling certainty that their king was not just harsh, but perverse, that his cruelty was not a means to an end, but an end in itself, a source of twisted amusement. It was a genuine oversight, a minor infraction in the grand scheme of things, but Kellen seized upon it with an almost gleeful intensity. Kellen's edicts, carried by trembling royal messengers, reached the farthest corners of the Ivory Kingdom. He would order the construction of bizarre contraptions in the palace courtyard, their purposes unknown until the moment of the decreed punishment. A man accused of petty theft was condemned to be weighed by his honesty. He was placed on a massive scale, facing an identical scale laden with bags of gold. The king declared that if his honesty could outweigh the gold, he would be spared. As the man prayed, the king's guards subtly added more gold to the opposing scale, until the man's side lifted off the ground, leaving him suspended in the air, slowly strangling on the ropes that bound him, all while Kellen observed with an eerie fascination occasionally offering suggestions to Gorak on how to make the process more visually interesting. Villages that had once enjoyed a simple, peaceful existence found themselves subject to the Child King's whims. A dispute over a shared irrigation ditch between two farming families resulted in ordering that both families be forced to drink from the stagnant ditch until one collapsed from illness, thus proving the other's superiority in the eyes of the king. The losing family would then face summary execution. The villagers, once quick to settle disputes with negotiation and community elders, now lived in a constant state of agonizing indecision, fearing that any conflict, however minor, could attract the king's attention and unleash an unfathomable horror. "This is not merely disrespect," he declared, his eyes gleaming with an unholy light, "but a corruption of lineage, a theft of the very essence of the crown." His voice, though still that of a child, carried an unnerving weight. The court expected a severe reprimand, perhaps imprisonment. Instead, Kellen announced a public spectacle. The official, a man named Lord Varin, would be forced to wear the very crown he had misplaced but inverted its points, digging into his scalp for 3 days, before being stripped bare and made to walk through the streets of the capital pelted with rotten fruit, culminating in his public disembowelment in the central square. He would spend hours in his private chambers, surrounded by scrolls depicting ancient instruments of torture and medieval methods of dispatch, his small finger tracing their grim lines. He would then summon his chief executioner, a man named Gorak, a towering figure with a scarred face and eyes that had seen too much. Gorak, a veteran of countless grim duties, found himself increasingly unnerved by the Child King's requests. Kellen would sketch crude drawings on parchment, illustrating his vision for an execution, his small voice detailing the precise sequence of events, the timing, the audience's vantage points. Even the theatrical courtiers moved like automatons, their faces carefully schooled to display nothing but placid obedience, their eyes mirroring the fear they dared not voice. The Child King, sitting upon his oversized ivory throne, became the silent, watchful eye, observing his kingdom with an unnerving detachment, much like a spider observing its trapped prey. The Ivory Kingdom, once a beacon of peace, now found itself encased in a gilded cage, its people living under the constant shadow of a child's capricious and increasingly cruel imagination. Kellen's fascination with executions evolved from a mere intellectual curiosity into an active, almost joyful participation in their planning and execution. One such instance, forever etched into the minds of those who witnessed it, was the trial of the misplaced crown. Queen Isolde, aghast at the chilling barbarity of the decree, made a desperate plea. The theater of cruelty, as it became known in hushed whispers, was not confined to the capital. Kellen's games of execution became increasingly elaborate, drawing inspiration from ancient myths and forgotten torture methods, but always with his own unique, chilling twist. The common people, once devoted to their benevolent royal family, now lived in a state of perpetual dread. Queen Isolde, now a pale, trembling shadow of her former self, withdrew entirely from court life. The king's advisors, men of great learning and political acumen, found themselves similarly trapped. The kingdom's economy, once thriving, began to stagnate. Yet, despite the terror, despite the mounting despair, no open rebellion ignited. Kellen's system of control was absolute. Kellen, oblivious to the widespread suffering he inflicted, saw his kingdom as a grand stage, his subjects as actors in his macabre play. The haunting images multiplied, the jester's swinging form against the dawn sky, Lord Varen's agony in the square, the farmer left to starve for a trivial trespass. The grotesque theatre of King Kellen's cruelties, once confined to the capital, now cast its long, suffocating shadow over every corner of the Ivory Kingdom. The vibrant tapestry of Eldorian life frayed and unraveled, thread by agonizing thread. He began to demand not just public executions, but detailed, personal reports on the last moments of every condemned soul. He would summon Gorak, the chief executioner, to his private study, often late into the night. From her high window, she could see the execution square, a constant reminder of the horrors unfolding beneath her. Neighboring monarchs, having heard the unsettling rumors from found the tales of a child king ordering executions for sport too monstrous to fully comprehend, dismissing them as exaggerated hearsay or the desperate fabrications of a queen dethroned by a ruthless regent. Children, rewarded with sweets and trinkets for reporting the slightest infraction or whispered complaint from their parents, became unwitting tools of terror. The emptying villages, the silent streets, the bowed heads of his subjects. These were not signs of despair, but of perfect obedience. He spent his days in the palace, surrounded by his macabre miniatures, observing his playthings and devising new games. A man accused of merely thinking ill of the king was brought before Kellen. Instead of a swift execution, the king decreed that the man be placed in a specially constructed chamber lined with thousands of tiny, razor-sharp pins. The haunting images of Kellen's victims, once sources of paralysis, began to transform into icons of righteous fury, and a few brave, or perhaps mad, scholars who believed that Eldoria's soul itself was at stake. They met in secret, under the cover of the moonless nights, their faces grim, their voices low, fueled by a terrible resolve. Their discussions were not of glory or power, but of the absolute necessity of ending the Child King's reign of terror, a reign that threatened to consume Eldoria entirely. They knew the risks were immense, that Kaelin's network of child spies was everywhere, that his cruelties were unpredictable, but the memory of his victims, the silent screams that echoed in their minds, outweighed any fear of personal consequence. The time for desperate measures was drawing near. The shadows of Eldoria were not just spreading, they were stirring, preparing to unleash a storm of vengeance against the very child who had conjured their darkness. The theater of cruelty had played for too long, and its silent audience was finally beginning to find its voice, a voice of collective fury and an unyielding demand for justice, no matter how brutal its enactment might be. The chilling truth was that Eldoria, once proud and peaceful, was now poised on the brink of a bloody reckoning, a desperate attempt to reclaim its soul from the clutches of a monstrous, innocent king. The jester, Lord Varan, the crippled page, the silent confession. These were not just victims, but martyrs, their agonies becoming a rallying cry, an unbearable weight that slowly, inexorably, pushed the people from passive despair to desperate defiance. The very cruelty that Kellen inflicted was, ironically, forging the tools of his eventual downfall. He would not be impaled, but merely confined, unable to move without piercing his own flesh. The man was told he would be released only if he confessed his treasonous thoughts in a voice audible throughout the palace. 4 days, the court listened to the faint sounds emanating from the chamber, the soft scrape of flesh against pin, the agonizing, barely audible gasps, the choked sobs. But the man, whether truly innocent or simply too terrified to speak, remained silent. Kellen, seated on his throne, would listen, occasionally tapping his small fingers, waiting. On the 5th day, the sounds ceased. When the chamber was opened, the man was found dead, his body a map of self-inflicted wounds, his face a silent testament to his unyielding refusal, or his inability, to confess. Kellen merely shrugged. He lacked imagination. He commented to Gorik, a chilling assessment that left the executioner trembling. His pale skin, once a sign of delicate health, now possessed an almost translucent quality. Queen Isolde, though confined, found a new, terrible strength in her despair. She began to focus her desperate pleas, not on foreign intervention, but on the remaining loyal elements within Eldoria itself, on those few who still remembered the benevolent rule of her late husband. She smuggled out messages, not of hope, but of vengeance, of the dire necessity of ending Kellen's reign, no matter the cost. Her loyal servants, their hearts heavy with grief and fear, carried these messages to the few remaining military commanders who remembered King Theron's justice, to the few remaining scholars who mourned the decay of Eldorian civilization, and to the common folk who had lost everything but their lives. And his eyes, though still bright, held a chilling, distant gleam, as if his mind resided in a world separate from the grim reality he created. He rarely left the palace, his world shrinking to the confines of his morbid imagination and the echoes of his chilling commands. They were innocent informers, their loyalty manipulated, their natural curiosity twisted into a surveillance apparatus that shattered trust within families and communities. No one was safe, no secret in the innocent eyes of a child in the marketplace could conceal a chilling loyalty to the king, and a casual word could lead to unimaginable horror. This internal policing, fueled by childhood naivety and the promise of small rewards, ensured that no organized resistance could truly form. The people of Eldoria, starved, terrified, and constantly watched, were too broken, too utterly demoralized, to mount any meaningful challenge to the king. Who could truly believe such depravity could emanate from the innocent heart of a child? They sent cautious envoys, polite inquiries, but no armies. He began to demand that certain condemned individuals undergo a series of tortures, not for information or confession, but to observe the nuanced ways the human spirit fractured under prolonged duress. He would compel Garak to describe, in excruciating detail, the physical and psychological stages of suffering, often interrupting to suggest variations or specific methods of inflicting particular pains. He seemed to approach this not with sadism, but with the dispassionate curiosity of a scientist studying a complex organism. He was charting the human capacity for endurance, finding a perverse intellectual stimulation in pushing the boundaries of life and death. Eldoria remained an isolated, terrifying spectacle, a pariah state from which few dared to return. The chilling reality was that the world, in its own cynical wisdom, found it easier to disbelieve a truth so horrifying than to confront it. Her once beautiful face was now gaunt and etched with sorrow, her eyes reed-rimmed from endless, unwept tears. Her pleas, her arguments, her very existence had become an irrelevant whisper against the deafening roar of Kellen's absolute power. She spent her days in prayer, not for her son's soul, for she believed it utterly lost, but for the suffering people of Eldoria, for a deliverance that seemed increasingly unattainable. Her only solace was a secret, forbidden communication channel with a few loyal, desperate servants who dared to defy the king, smuggling out messages of the atrocities, pleading for help from outside kingdoms, igniting faint, flickering embers of hope for intervention. Garak, his face a mask of perpetually grim resignation, would recount the precise details, the final words, the struggles, the expressions of despair or defiance. Kellen would listen intently, his small face illuminated by the flickering candlelight, a strange, almost serene contentment settling over him. Farmers, living in constant fear of arbitrary punishments or confiscation of their meager harvests, abandoned their fields, seeking refuge in the deep forests or the remote mountains, becoming little more than reclusive hermits. The once bustling marketplaces now stood desolate, stalls empty, the air heavy with dust and the silence of abandonment. Artisans, their creativity stifled by terror, ceased producing the exquisite crafts for which Eldoria was once famous. The kingdom, bleeding life from every pore, was slowly, agonizingly, decaying from within, consumed by the madness of its child ruler. He would ask probing questions, not out of malice, but from a detached, clinical curiosity, seeking to understand every nuance of suffering and finality. He no longer sketched crude drawings. Instead, he commanded artisans to craft intricate miniatures of his planned executions, tiny gallows, miniature racks, and Lilliputian guillotine models, all rendered in exquisite detail, which he would arrange and rearrange on a vast table in his chambers, a macabre dollhouse where death was the only game. Laughter died in the throats of children, replaced by a fearful silence. The joyous festivals, once celebrated with unbridled merriment, became grim, mandatory assemblies where the populace was forced to witness the king's latest, most perverse spectacles of punishment. The very air of Eldoria seemed to grow heavy, thick with unspoken dread, and the chilling anticipation of the next unpredictable decree from the child king, who saw life and death as his personal play. Kellen's fascination with death, once an unsettling quirk, had spiraled into a full-blown obsession. His cruelty knew no bounds of status or age. Even the children of the court, once considered protected, found themselves subject to his chilling whims. A young page, barely 10 years old, was caught accidentally spilling a goblet of wine on the king's robes during a banquet. The court braced for a harsh punishment, but not death. Kellen, however, fixed his piercing gaze on the boy. "Clumsiness," he declared, his voice cold and clear, "is a betrayal of elegance, and elegance is the soul of Eld." He then ordered that the page be forced to stand motionless, holding the goblet above his head, until the wine evaporated completely, a process that would take days, causing excruciating muscle fatigue and dehydration. If he faltered, even for a moment, his hands would be amputated. The boy, trembling uncontrollably, endured the first day, his small body racked with pain. But on the second morning, he collapsed, his spirit broken. Kellen, observing from a distance, merely shook his head. "A weakling," he murmured, before ordering the boy's hands severed. a punishment that crippled the child for life, condemning him to a life of begging and shame. The boy's silent, enduring agony served as a stark, chilling warning to every child in Eldorya. The queen, confined to her tower, was a silent, tormented witness to her son's escalating depravity. These desperate pleas, however, often arrived too late or were met with fear and disbelief. The very infrastructure of Eldorya began to crumble. Roads fell into disrepair, bridges weakened, and the once grand irrigation systems that watered the fertile plains lay neglected. The network of child spies, initiated by Kellen, became even more pervasive and insidious. Kellen, meanwhile, saw his kingdom's decline not as a failure, but as a demonstration of his absolute control. The most disturbing development, however, was Kellen's growing interest in ritualistic executions, practices derived from the darkest corners of Eldorya's forgotten history. One instance, recounted in hushed tones by a surviving court scribe who secretly documented Kellen's atrocities, was the trial of the Silent Confession. This escalating cruelty, this increasingly bizarre fascination with the minutiae of suffering, began to sow the first fragile seeds of true, desperate rebellion, not among the living, but among the few who retained a spark of their lost humanity. The whispers of resistance, once too faint to be heard over the kingdom's collective terror, slowly began to grow, fueled by the accumulating horrors. A small, clandestine network began to form, comprised of disillusioned palace guards, grieving family members of Kellen's victims. The fragile whispers of vengeance, once drowned out by the pervasive fear, now resonated with a desperate clarity throughout the decaying heart of Eldorya. Queen Isolde, a spectral figure in her tower prison, watched the kingdom bleed, her grief hardening into a terrible resolve. Her secret communications, smuggled by the few servants still loyal to the memory of King Tyrant, had finally found fertile ground. A scattered but resolute network of resistance began to coalesce. Disillusioned captains of the royal guard, who had witnessed too many horrors. It was a subtle gesture from a loyal guard captain, a seemingly innocuous cough. In that instant, a coordinated strike rippled through the palace. The few remaining loyalist guards, lulled by years of routine and the apparent invulnerability of the child king, were quickly, silently overwhelmed. His face, for the first time, registered not just confusion, but a flicker of something akin to annoyance, as if his performance had been rudely interrupted. He tried to issue a command, his small voice surprisingly strong amidst the din, but his words were cut short. Queen Isolde stepped forward, her eyes brimming with tears, not of pity, but of profound sorrow for the monstrous thing her child had become. He was undeniably a monster, responsible for unimaginable suffering, but he was also just a child, barely 7 years old. The court advisors, now free to speak their minds, were divided. Some argued for immediate execution, for a swift end to the source of Eldorya's agony. He never spoke again, his eyes, still that chilling blue, fixed on the distant mainland, endlessly watching. But the legend of the child king, confined to his solitary tower, eternally watching a world he could no longer touch, lived on in hushed whispers. The silence of the throne, once filled with his chilling commands, was replaced by the solemn echoes of a kingdom striving for peace. But for those who knew the true story, the haunting image of the small, silent figure on a distant island, his eyes fixed on the horizon, condemned to an eternity of powerless observation, remained a chilling testament to the consequences of a unique, terrifying cruelty. The echoes of his silent rage, of his impotent fury, would forever cling to the desolate shores of his island prison, a final, chilling note in the dark symphony of Eldorya's forgotten past. His guards, silent and unyielding, ensured his survival, fulfilling their role as his eternal, living Eldorya, slowly, painfully, began to heal. Queen Isolde, her mission accomplished, dedicated her remaining years to rebuilding the kingdom, her reign remembered for its profound grief and its even more profound act of grim justice. The stories of Kellen, the child king, became a haunting legend, a terrifying cautionary tale of the darkness that could reside even in the most innocent of forms, and the terrible price of unchecked power. Others, recoiling from the thought of executing a child, even one so depraved, suggested lifelong imprisonment. But Queen Isolde, her heart broken, but her resolve forged in the fires of her own torment, proposed a solution as unique and chilling as Kellen's own. She reached out, her hand hovering over Kellen's head, but she did not touch him. nor will he be imprisoned within these walls, for his influence still lingers. He would see the faint smoke from villages slowly rebuilding, the minuscule ships of fishermen venturing out, the distant, shimmering green of fields slowly returning to life. He would witness the rebirth of the kingdom he had sought to destroy, an endless silent movie of a world reclaiming its joy, its peace, its very essence, a world from which he was forever banished, unable to touch, unable to control, unable to destroy. His hands, though healed, would remain useless, a constant, physical reminder of his impotence. His mind, still brilliant, would be his own torturer, trapped in a perpetual loop of observation and powerlessness. There would be no escape, no ending, only the endless, silent spectacle of a thriving Eldoria, forever out of his reach. He will be unmasked, stripped of all power, and forced to witness, endlessly, the lives he sought to extinguish. Her plan, meticulously detailed, was a perverse mirror of Kellen's own fascination with spectacle and observation. Kellen was to be taken to a remote, desolate island off the coast of Eldoria, known for its treacherous currents and its impenetrable, thorny forests. There, a small, solitary tower would be built, tall enough to see the distant shores of the mainland, yet utterly isolated. He would be confined within, his hands permanently bound, his every need attended to by a select group of silent guards, survivors of his own cruelties, or relatives of his victims, whose faces were permanently etched with grief and vengeance. Their duty was not to speak to him, not to interact, but merely to sustain his life, and to ensure he could see. She merely looked at him, her gaze reflecting years of despair, of lost hope. Eldoria reclaims its soul. Kellen, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, and you, my son, will never again wield power over a single living thing. The resistance leader, a grizzled old commander named General Renard, whose own family had suffered under Kellen's whims, stepped forward, his sword pointed at the child king. Your reign of terror ends now. Kellen, he roared, his voice thick with years of suppressed rage. The resistance, moving with brutal efficiency, secured the palace gates, then made their way to the royal hall. He mused, his voice strangely calm. A merely enacted justice, General, a king's prerogative. But before he could continue, Garak the executioner acted. With the ceremonial dagger he had taken from Kellen, he moved swiftly, silently. He did not aim for the heart, nor the throat. Instead, with a practiced, brutal precision honed by years of grim duties, he severed the tendons in Kellen's hands, rendering them utterly useless. The child king cried out, a sharp, piercing sound, a sound of pain, not fear. His precious, small hands, the instruments of his macabre artistry, were now broken, incapable of wielding scepter or pen, incapable of sketching another gruesome design. It was a symbolic act, a silent declaration that the tools of his cruelty were forever denied to him. Inside, a small detachment of Kellen's personal guard, handpicked for their ferocity and unquestioning loyalty to the boy, still stood sentinel around the king. They were fanatically devoted to Kellen, seeing his cruelty as a mark of divine power, an unchallengeable authority. Scholars who mourned the kingdom's spiraling descent into barbarity and common folk, broken by loss, but fueled by an unquenchable thirst for an end to the madness. He leaned forward, his small hands gripping the railing, his face a picture of serene fascination as the farmer cried out. The loyalist guards, surprised and outnumbered, put up a fierce but futile resistance. Swords clashed, the cries of battle echoing through the sudden silence that had fallen over the square below. The people, looking up, saw the chaos, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning hope. Amidst the melee, Queen Isolde, her face gaunt but alight with a fierce resolve, emerged from the newly opened doors of her prison tower, flanked by loyal servants. Her eyes, filled with a terrible sadness, were fixed on her son. It was then that Gorak the chief executioner moved. Gorak, whose soul had been slowly corroded by years of executing the king's horrifying decrees, had reached his breaking point. He had seen too much, been forced to inflict too much. His scarred face, usually impassive, now twitched with a grim resolve. As Kellen turned to offer a suggestion about the heat of the coals, Garak's massive hand shot out, not to harm the king, but to wrench a small, ornate dagger from Keelan's belt. A ceremonial dagger, meant for display, but sharp enough for purpose. The Child King was momentarily bewildered, his expression shifting from detached amusement to confusion. The haunting images of Kellen's victims, the jester, Lord Varenne, the crippled page, the silent confession, had transformed from symbols of terror into rallying cries, a silent army of martyrs demanding justice. The plan was born of desperation and an intimate knowledge of Kellen's perverse routines. The Child King, increasingly withdrawn and absorbed in his macabre games, rarely left the palace. Kellen had decreed a grand public spectacle, a trial of falsehoods, aimed at a group of farmers accused of exaggerating their crop failures, thereby defrauding the crown of its rightful tribute. The punishment was to be a dance of truths, where each farmer would be forced to dance on hot coals while confessing their sins. The king, he announced, would determine the truth by the vigor of their confession. Amidst their agony, the central square of the capital was packed, not with eager spectators, but with a silent, trembling multitude, forced witnesses to the next act in Kellen's morbid play. High above, from a specially constructed balcony, Kellen sat on a miniature throne, surrounded by his personal guard, his face alight with a chilling anticipation, his eyes fixed on the makeshift stage below. His world had shrunk to the confines of his chambers and the great hall, where he presided over his grotesque spectacles. The key was to strike swiftly, decisively, during one of his performances, when his focus would be entirely consumed by the theater of cruelty he so cherished. The resistance knew their numbers were few, their resources limited, but their resolve was absolute. They would reclaim Eldaria's soul, even if it meant extinguishing the life of the child who held it hostage. The chosen day arrived, cloaked in an unnatural stillness. As the first terrified farmer was led to the glowing coals, a signal was given. Meanwhile, on the balcony overlooking the square, Kellen's attention was fully consumed by the unfolding agony below. At that precise moment, the resistance burst onto the balcony. Kellen, momentarily disoriented by the sudden intrusion, saw his mother, then the armed men. Kellen merely looked at Renard, his sky-blue eyes, for the first time, showing a hint of something other than detachment, a spark of chilling curiosity. The resistance quickly overpowered Kellen's remaining guards. The Child King, his face contorted in a rare display of genuine physical agony, was seized. The rebellion had succeeded, but the immediate aftermath was fraught with a terrible dilemma. What was to be done with the Child King? "He will not be executed," she declared, her voice firm, for that would be a mercy he never granted. From the highest window of his island prison, Kellen would be forced to watch, day after day, the distant shores of The plan was executed with grim efficiency. Kellen, still bewildered by the sudden shift in his reality, was transported to the island. The very name of Eldoria itself was eventually changed, lost to the sands of time, a deliberate act to erase the stain of Kellen's reign, a testament to the collective trauma it had endured.